Go ahead, Pramod.
All right, yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's seminar series and the Frontiers in Mechanical Engineering seminar series. I'm Pramod Reddy from the University of Michigan. Let me begin by thanking first the organizing committee, who is shown here, especially Professor Devesh for organizing this seminar series and bringing together a great set of speakers and moderators over the last few weeks. So before we begin today's seminar, let me do a quick plug-in for next week's seminar, which is on thermal systems, and it will feature two assistant professors, one Dion Antau from Texas A&M, and Vinod Srinivasan from the University of Minnesota. I'll be moderated by Professor Bud Peterson, and so this will be at the same time Friday next week. So today's seminar is on interfacial science. It features two young, outstanding scientists and engineers, Marta Hatzell, Professor Marta Hatzell from Georgia Tech, and Professor Wenxiao Pan from University of Wisconsin-Madison. So my role today is to introduce the moderator, Dr. Ravi Prasher, and then I will let Ravi run the show while he can, and if necessary, I'll step in. So let me quickly introduce Dr. Prasher. Dr. Ravi Prasher is currently at the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, where he is the Associate Lab Director. I can tell you a lot about Ravi's accomplishments and the editorial boards he has served on and so on, but perhaps it's more interesting to present a more personal view of Ravi and what he has done. So I came to know of Ravi when I was a graduate student, and Dr. Prasher, I'm referring to as Ravi, was at Intel, right? And I would read his papers, and he used to be so prolific. He had a day job at Intel, and he would publish these papers, which perhaps would put to shame a very accomplished group. Often, many of the papers would be like single author papers in leading journals. So Ravi, after working at Intel for several years, moved on to ARPA-E to help start ARPA-E, as well as two key programs there, one in buildings and another in thermal storage. He has spent his time both in industry, government, academia, which I know of very few people who have spanned this number of agencies, and in spite of doing all these things, he's been very prolific. Right? So he's currently at Berkeley, Berkeley National Labs, and he's doing very interesting science and engineering while also doing a lot of administrative work. Right? So that said, I will stop and hand over the moderating responsibilities to Ravi. So let me stop sharing.
Thank you for a very kind introduction, Pramod. Can you guys confirm that you can still hear me? I just want to make sure.
I can hear you, and I'm muting myself so that there is.
Okay. All right. So first of all, let me say thanks to Devesh for inviting me to moderate this session. I was not aware of this kind of an event, and I think it's very unique. This whole idea of multiple university seminar for early career faculty members, I find it very, very novel and exciting. And I'm definitely going to mention it to the department chair here at UC Berkeley as well. In particular, I'm very excited about today's talks. I'll tell you why. As Pramod pointed out, that I've spent quite a bit of time in both large companies R&D as well as in a startup. And in fact, when I was at Intel and even when I was a startup, I spent a lot of time dealing with interfaces. Okay. Let me start with a quote from Wolfgang Pauli, the famous physicist who came up with the Pauli's exclusion principle. I remember this. I read it somewhere and it got stuck in my brain. Here's the quote: God made the bulk, the surface was invented by the devil. Okay, there's a very famous quote from Pauli. Now imagine the interface between two surfaces. That makes it really interesting and very challenging, right? And from the science point of view. And that's one part, right? I mean, there's so many questions that needs to still to be answered. But more importantly, what I find very interesting and unique about interfaces is that it plays a significant role in many technologies. Okay, as I said, I spent a significant time in the industrial R&D, and most of the time we were always dealing with interface issues. Now, whether it is microelectronics, I spent time at Intel, or right now, one of the divisions that falls under my purview here in the lab is batteries. They do a lot of battery research. Again, interfaces. Okay. Then you talk about water desalination, thermal management. It's all interfaces, right? So that's why I find this today's topic on interfaces to be fascinating. And I think we have two very, very top-class phenomenal researchers here who will talk about their research. And I'm really looking forward to it personally, and I hope the audience will find the talks very stimulating as well. So with that, let me introduce our first speaker of today, Wenxiao Pan. She is assistant professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she is going to give a talk on data-driven reduced order modeling for fluid-solid interactions and soft matter. Professor Pan received her PhD in applied mathematics at Brown University before joining University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2016. She worked at Pacific Northwest National Lab as a postdoc and as a staff scientist. Her research group at Madison focuses on multi-scale modeling of soft matter and fluids-related multi-physical systems through accurate, robust, and scalable numerical methods and data-driven approaches. Her current projects are supported by NSF and DoD. So I'm looking forward to her talk. And then our second speaker is Professor Marta Hatzell. Dr. Hatzell joined Georgia Tech Mechanical Engineering Department in 2015 as an assistant professor. She obtained her bachelor's, master's, and PhD, all from mechanical engineering, and a master's in environmental engineering from Penn State. She was a national NSF graduate research fellow and a philanthropic educational organization scholar during her PhD. She also received the NSF Career Award in 2019, ONR Young Investigation Award in 2020, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Fellowship in Chemistry in 2020. Her research, Dr. Hatzell's lab mission is to innovate next-generation sustainable separations and catalytic technologies to augment food, energy, and water systems. Her primary contributions have focused on demonstrating the prospects for electrochemical separations and catalysis and in unraveling interface mechanisms. With that, I'll hand it over to the speakers and looking forward to their talks. Thank you.
Should I start first or first speaker?
Either way is fine. According to the schedule I have in front of me, Marta goes first, so perhaps we can
Okay, then I'll go. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I'll try to stay on time here. I want to first note that most of this work has been completed by my PhD students, Carol Liu, Jung-Hoon Lim, and Carlos Fernandez. And the title of this talk is Managing the Nitrogen Cycle with Electrochemistry. And so my group has really noticed over the years that there's been a large disconnect between how we make chemical fertilizers in the chemical industry and how we utilize chemical fertilizers in the agricultural industry. And this disconnect between our chemical industry and our agricultural industry has resulted in a large amount of environmental impacts associated with basically lost fertilizers into the atmosphere and into soils and into water. And so basically, while Carol, Jung-hoon, and Carlos are addressing different aspects of managing the nitrogen cycle, they're all fundamentally looking at designing next generation technologies which close this gap between chemical fertilizer industry and our agricultural sector. So this is also, I would say, note that this is at the interface of energy-food nexus, but my research group really does focus on all different technologies related to water, energy, and food, which we won't be able to cover all today. I also wanted to, since like these platforms don't often give us the opportunity to really look, to interact in person, I thought that I'd start this talk off by asking you to complete a very short survey. And the survey is based off of surveying your understanding of the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. So with your cell phone, or I know we're all sitting at a computer, I want to ask you to open up the screen, type in this menti.com, and enter this code here. And so when this code popped, when you pop this code in, 4 questions will be asked of you. It's multiple choice. I know it's Friday afternoon, but try your best. Partial credit's always given, so don't worry about that. But this is, I just want to first have you go through these quizzes. We'll go through the results. And so take, 5 seconds or 10 seconds to do that. And while you're doing that, I just really want to acknowledge that I wish I could talk about all my students' work because each and every one of them has really exciting work that's ongoing. But this is a short presentation and I only can cover a few of their work. I also we get to work with really great undergrads at Georgia Tech, really great faculty. And then also we work with a lot of different staff scientists at national labs. Through all these interactions, it's really turned the way that the research has gone. So we really acknowledge all of these individuals. And of course, I want to acknowledge the funding which allows this research to take place. So with that, I'm going to actually try to switch screens and I'll show you the results from these 4 questions I just asked you. All right, so the first question was about our carbon cycle, and it says, how much atmospheric concentrations, what's our atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration? And I want to say that this is a educated group, and most of you know that we're at 411 currently. But I think the most people are aware that we're basically exceeded 400 parts per million, and that's one of these large challenges. We need to stop going up, but right now we're actually at 411. The next question was, the IPCC says that we need to restrict global temperature rise to what? So I'm not surprised to see 2 degrees Celsius. Historically, it has been 2 degrees Celsius. As of 2019, that number actually decreased to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that's actually a bad sign because it means that we are approaching our limits quick, and there is a large need to mitigate this carbon dioxide emission problem. The next problem is associated with our nitrogen cycle. And so the question was, what percentage of our global population depends on chemical fertilizers? It is a lot, but it's actually 50% right now. And so what that means is that if we got rid of synthetic fertilizers, 50% of the world's population wouldn't be able to survive. And so this is tremendously important. Oftentimes in environments, when looking at mitigating environmental impacts, we often want to just disregard chemical fertilizers because they are bad for the environment. But with 50% of the global population depending on it, that's not likely a solution to our problem. And the next question was, how many chemical plants produce 140 million tons of ammonia per year? And this is also good. You did well. It's less than 100 are responsible for producing this many tons of ammonia per year. So we have a very few number of these Haber-Bosch plants. And so that is what we're going to motivate some of the work that we do at Georgia Tech. So with that, I'll jump back into this presentation. And so oftentimes these days when we're talking about sustainability, we're basically looking a lot at the carbon cycle. And this is our carbon cycle, or this is our basically our nitrogen cycle, our carbon cycle, and our phosphorus cycle. And so these, a lot of times with sustainability, we talk about this carbon cycle, but we leave out a discussion of the nitrogen cycle. And these are all the fluxes within our nitrogen and carbon. And you probably recall this from your 9th or 10th grade chemistry class. And here's your atmosphere, here's your land, and here's your ocean. And there's a lot going on in this diagram, but what I want you to really pay attention to are these blue fluxes denote the natural unperturbed fluxes, whereas the orange denotes the anthropogenic perturbations. And if we look close at those anthropogenic perturbations, there's two things that stand out. One, it's NOx emissions due to fossil fuel burning, and the other is fertilizer, basically deposition. And so when looking at how we are moving away from equilibrium with our carbon cycle, we're often looking at how we mitigate our carbon dioxide emissions. When we're looking at equilibrating and managing our nitrogen cycle, we're really going to be having to focus on these fertilizer industry. Over the last couple of decades since this work was published, we've actually done a great job at mitigating NOx from power plants and from the ground transportation sector, but we really haven't paid attention to the nitrogen that's being lost due to these fertilizers. And so when you think about managing the nitrogen cycle, the question is, how do we manage it now? Well, typically we rely on biology to transform all these different forms of nitrogen from one form to the other. What happens is, however, what happens with this mass balance, when you introduce a large flux such as ammonia or nitrate, which is in our fertilizers, is we realize that biology can't keep up with the mass that we're adding to the system. And so we start to see an excess of ammonia, which volatilizes into our atmosphere and is a much more harmful greenhouse gas than CO2. And we start to see nitrate in our groundwater, which is very hazardous to our public health. And so we can rely on evolution of these bacteria and soils to accelerate these transformation processes and maybe eventually one day balance the nitrogen cycle that we have unbalanced. But that's unlikely to happen quickly. And so we have to start thinking of solutions that can start to take some of these excess waste streams and remediate them. And so as an electrochemist, engineer, whenever I see a bunch of redox processes or processes where an electron transfer process occurs at an interface, I think of basically electrochemistry as a means to transform these various nitrogen components. And so this is just a cyclic voltammogram, but this cyclic voltammogram demonstrates the ability to tune a process, for instance, nitrate to nitrogen gas or nitrogen gas to ammonia. So just by tuning the interface potential, we can dictate the rate at which we catalyze these various reactions. And so this is very powerful from a design perspective as a way to abiotically control the nitrogen cycle. So at Georgia Tech, Jung Hoon is really looking at designing interfaces that can convert this waste stream, nitrate, to either nitrogen gas, which is inert, or nitrate to ammonia, which is potentially a valuable resource. Carol and Carlos are also looking at sustainable ways to basically convert nitrogen to ammonia. Ultimately, with our work from nitrogen to ammonia, we look to displace this Haber-Bosch process where we're relying on fossil fuels and replace it with a process that's driven by solar energy. So the goals of this presentation, I'm not going to be able to go through all three of these, but typically this is the way that I like to discuss our work. We like to highlight or better understand the mechanistic understanding of these reactions at these interfaces. And once we understand the mechanisms, only then will we move on to understanding and design of materials. And finally, we do like to look at many length scales in my lab. And so we like to take this mechanistic understanding of materials design and then ultimately use this for systems design engineering so that we can ultimately design efficient and economical systems. And so again, these are the three students working on these three projects. And today I'll only really get to highlight this first aspect of understanding mechanisms at catalytic systems. And so I want to introduce how we make ammonia today. we need energy. It's a non-spontaneous process. We need to put energy in. And typically, as mechanical engineers, we know well pressure and temperature. And so we put an iron-based catalyst in a system. We design a system that's able to withstand certain pressure and temperature, and we drive the reaction. Typically, our reactants are nitrogen, hydrogen. We dissociatively adsorb nitrogen to this iron-based catalyst, and we basically hydrogenate that adsorbed nitrogen to get to ammonia. This seems like a simple process when thinking about it now. Just put a reactant in, have a catalyst, high temperature, high pressure. But it has resulted, it's very significant and sometimes thought of as the most important discovery of the 20th century, and is why Haber won the Nobel Prize for designing the chemistry in 1918. Bosch won the Nobel Prize for engineering many of the systems and preventing corrosion. And then Edgar Gertel won the Nobel Prize in 2007 for really just understanding the mechanisms of this reaction at these conditions using vacuum-based surface science. When we moved away from thermocatalysis to photocatalysis, we opened up a lot of questions because the reaction mechanism is not going to be a dissociative mechanism. It's going to be completely different. Typically, we're going to use a new catalyst, which is going to have new surfaces and new interfaces. So typically, we use a semiconductor where we shine light on the semiconductor and photogenerate electrons. Those electrons can navigate to that interface and interact with nitrogen, hopefully reducing it to hydrogen. But like I said, this is not a well-studied process, and so there are many different pathways that nitrogen can interact and end up as ammonia, and we don't know which way it takes place currently. And so this really has led our group to begin to address this through basically the use of surface science and spectroscopy. And so basically, I want to motivate why photocatalysis. Photocatalysis typically has a bad maybe reputation in the catalysis world because we don't really see many technologies that have made it to market. But photocatalysis to us has been seen as ideal because ultimately solar is available everywhere, and it enables us to close this inequity that we're seeing in nutrient distribution. It closes the carbon, it decreases the carbon footprint of this process tremendously, and ultimately it also decreases the safety challenges associated with the transport of ammonia. As we all knew recently, when we have only 100 Haber-Bosch plants located, we find ourselves often shipping this over far distances, 4,000 miles even, and that storage of ammonium nitrate it has very high standards, and if not kept up to speed, we have catastrophic failure events. And so really we're trying to look at how can you use solar energy and how can you make this near the site of use. And so how can it compete with the Haber-Bosch process? Well, if you look at making simple assumptions about solar energy input and agricultural demand, we know that our plant requires 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. We know that perhaps we can harvest maybe all of the solar spectrum, but more likely part of the solar spectrum. And we know that we don't want to use all of our land. And so if we make these assumptions, we basically find that the solar to ammonia efficiency required to meet the plant's needs is only on the order of 1%. To be fair, our technologies are far below that, but it opens the opportunity for technology development significantly. I'll note that titanium dioxide is not an ideal catalyst because it doesn't harvest a large portion of the solar spectrum. But you can see even with a poor catalyst, the required solar to ammonia efficiencies are quite low. If you start to look at lower band gap materials, you could that requirement would actually decrease. So I want to just highlight that this is not a new reaction. It has been studied for over 100 years. But the funny thing is that we still, as I mentioned, we still don't know much about how this reaction proceeds. It wasn't until 2017 when I think this pioneering work out of Japan basically hypothesized that oxygen vacancies at these surfaces allowed for the activation of this nitrogen bond, coupled with the presence of interstitial sites. There has been other theoretical investigations which have looked at hydroxylated-mediated processes, but still neither of these two pathways have been proven experimentally. And so we really don't believe that catalyst design is we're not yet at catalyst design. We really think we need to understand this mechanism. And so when you look at these photocatalysts, the concerns are, what are the electronic properties? How did the band edges align with the nitrogen reduction redox reaction? What are the surface properties? Are we able to adsorb and adsorb our reactant and desorb our product? We know that there's this optimum value of binding for our reactants and products that will allow this reaction to proceed. We also know that we need to have active sites because the nitrogen triple bond is one of the largest, strongest bonds in nature. And so 941 kilojoules per mole is large. So we have to have certain active sites, we have to have certain surfaces, and we have to have certain electronic properties. When I started working on this 5 years ago, I was working with A.J. Medford, who's a theorist, and we were trying to think about how this could proceed. And when you look at nitrogen to ammonia, it's a very uphill reaction. And without any applied potential, you're going to need, the first step of this reaction is 6 EV, which is very large and is very improbable to take place. And to make this a spontaneous process, you would need 2.5 volts. We also looked at ways that you could oxidize nitrogen, bringing nitrogen and oxygen, which is air, together, with a marginal voltage of 0.5 volts, you can start to see a downhole potential. So with that, our initial hypothesis was that nitrogen fixation on this wide band gap, non-active catalyst, titania, may be possible, but it's most likely fixed through an oxidative process. And then ammonia may form through a denitrification process. Carol set out into the lab and did a number of experiments with a number of different catalysts. And unfortunately, in all experiments, or fortunately, she wasn't able to detect any oxidized species, or they were below the limit of detection, which we don't think is reportable. But what she did find in all cases was ammonia. So then we went to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and we've been working with Ethan Crumlin there to start looking at these interfaces with a controlled setting. The benefits of ambient pressure XPS is that you can introduce various reactants, nitrogen, oxygen, water, and you can evaluate the reaction in situ. Initially, we did these experiments, and we saw this reduced nitrogen peak when illuminated with nitrogen gas. Unfortunately, we also saw that there was advantageous carbon on our samples. Typically, we like to clean this off before running our experiments. So we can easily clean this from our experiments by heat treating in air. And when doing that, you still will have some carbon, but it's minimized. However, when we cleaned the catalyst completely, we weren't seeing any interactions with nitrogen gas and our catalyst, which indicates that we definitely weren't having, if we weren't having adsorption, we definitely weren't having activation. So then we did another series of experiments where we basically looked to tune the carbon and looked to tune the surface oxygen vacancies. And so this is titanium dioxide without any oxygen vacancies. We were able to introduce oxygen vacancies into our sample and basically mitigate carbon. We were able to add carbon and add vacancies, and we were able to add carbon and also suppress these vacancies. In all the cases, there seemed to be no correlation with vacancies, but there was a correlation with the carbon that was present. So we bring this back to our theorists and we tell this to them. And of course, as experimentalists, we're actually quite negative because it means that we're not activating nitrogen. Our theorists were able to say, however, that there is potential for activation on this carbon site, something that we had not perceived. And AJ and Ben Comer, I'll note, did these calculations, and they showed that basically the binding energy of nitrogen was very strong to carbon, which was surprising to us. And it kind of helps us direct our future directions looking at basically carbon-based sites. They also looked at screening oxygen vacancies, carbon additions, and carbon and oxygen vacancies, which we investigated. And really, although there are theorized that these oxygen vacancies may do well, in terms of the stability of the active site in the lifetime, we don't perceive them to be really active, but these carbon sites potentially have a correct number of stability and adsorption energy for nitrogen. I'll say I'm not going to go more into this in depth, but this is a direction that we keep on going in, and we're currently working with Argonne National Lab to start to look at these interactions between nitrogen and carbon sites through EPR-based spectroscopy with Tajana Ranjan at Argonne. And so I'm just going to end with a reverse introduction. People always ask me, what does this look like? How is this going to transform the fertilizer industry? And we don't know, but we think that there's going to be a lot of different ways that you could have distributed ammonia production. In some cases, photocatalysis may make sense where you're completely at the farm scale. In other alternatives, electrochemical routes may make sense where we're looking at meeting the ammonia needs for a few farms at once. Another question that we often get is, will you be making the same fertilizers? So typically, we are actually trying to make a different type of fertilizer. Today, we use 35 to 85% solid weight ammonia, and we apply it to our land maybe once a season. The reason we do this is purely because it's easier to ship solids than it is to ship liquids. And so what we're actually we know that the amount of ammonia necessary is much lower than 35%. It's on the order of 1%. So we're actually trying to make lower concentration, safer fertilizers that can be applied directly to agricultural industry. But beyond catalysts, there's a lot of separation challenges as well. At the Haber-Bosch plants, they have to separate oxygen from air or oxygen from nitrogen, and they have to use cryogenic separations, which is up to 25% of the capital costs. There's no way that at these small scales we're going to use cryogenic separations. And so we're actually starting to look at how can we do this reaction in the presence of oxygen. So basically aerobic nitrogen fixation. And this is something that Carol has been looking at, and she's starting to develop catalysts that can perform, albeit slightly worse, in the presence of air than in nitrogen, but nearing the same performance. And so this is a potential new way that we can compete with these other catalytic technologies. And so these are my conclusions. We're really looking at both catalytic and non-catalytic ways that we can use solar energy to convert nitrogen to ammonia. We're really trying to look at transforming this capital-intensive environmental impact process into a potentially something that could take place at a farm or at least near the farm. We think that there's lots of opportunities with aqua ammonia and potentially looking at aerobic-based processes, which is going to be challenging, but hopefully worthwhile from an economic perspective. And with that, I just want to say happy Halloween. Please go out and vote. Acknowledge my group one last time. And just if you are interested in any of our group works, here are the papers that I discussed today.
Great. So I think they wish, according to instructions, perhaps we transition to the next speaker, Professor Wenxiao Pan, and we can take questions after.
Okay, can you hear me and also see my slides and mouse?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Prasher for his kind introduction, and also thanks the committee for inviting me to give this talk. Today I want to focus on two topics. And I want to focus on reduced order modeling, but for two types of problems. The first one is about dynamic systems with moving boundaries. The example application can be fluid-solid interactions or multi-phase flows. Anything that there is dynamics and also involves moving boundaries can be in this category. And the second system, I want to look at high-dimensional discrete system governed by Hamiltonians. For example, in molecular dynamics or in quantum mechanics, usually the system is high-dimensional, involves many degrees of freedom, and they are governed by Hamiltonians. And how we construct reduced order model for those kind of dynamic systems. That are the two topics I want to discuss today. Okay, I only briefly discussed the main ideas. And if you want to know the technical details, and you can refer to these two papers. And I also want to acknowledge my two students, Jen and Shu, for their great contributions to these two works, and also the funding support from NSF and ARO for these two topics. And now I'm moving everybody from experimental side to modeling, computation, and mathematics. Hopefully it's not too difficult for you to make the transition. Okay, let's look at the first type of system, dynamic systems with moving boundaries. For example, we can find many examples in fluid-solid interactions. And in this kind of systems, if, of course, you can do experiment to understand how the fluid and solid are interacting with each other and how the interface is evolving over time. From modeling computation side, we probably, if you are in this field, you know that, okay, we need to solve continuum incompressible fluid dynamics equations, and we need to deal with this arbitrarily shaped free moving solid boundaries, and which is not trivial if we solve the governing equations and find numerical solutions. So commonly people do high fidelity simulation and solve the corresponding PDEs, and those can be very expensive. So one way to reduce the cost is to do reduced order modeling. And here I want to mention two motivations for doing reduced order modeling. And firstly, of course, we will get a low dimensional model. So instead of doing high fidelity simulation, and we can use the low dimensional model to make prediction, and that will save a lot of computational cost. However, we know that reduced order modeling, the prediction can be limited. They cannot just predict for any parameter or any time that you want, because when we construct the reduced order model, we probably based on some data or some observations. So the other way to think about how to utilize reduced order modeling is we can pursue adaptive integration of reduced order modeling with high fidelity simulations or with experimental measurements. Okay, so I will discuss further on this aspect later. Okay, so now let's start with some mathematics. So first of all, let's frame the question. So let's see, we consider arbitrary spatial domain. It can be bounded with a fixed boundary, gamma f. And it can also include some moving boundaries. So omega m is a moving body with a moving boundary. Okay, we are dealing with a general problem like this. And here, what we need to construct the reduced order model is only data. We need snapshot data of the full order solution. For example, a flow field, a velocity field or pressure field, or any string field in solid mechanics and so on. Okay, those data can be obtained from simulations or experimental measurements. So it doesn't matter, you have to solve the equations and get simulation data. Here, if you don't want to solve the equation, but you have experimental measurement, then it also gives us the data that we can use to construct the reduced order model. And here, let's decompose the data first by a mean part and the fluctuating part. And we first do a proper orthogonal decomposition. This is very common in reduced order modeling. Okay, so many people are using this, and usually we use it to decompose the fluctuating part, and then we decompose in the sense that we separate the temporal mode and the spatial basis. And then, okay, since we already separate them to two different things, one is time, one is space, then according to the eigenvalues, we can choose the dominant modes, and then we can approximate the solution by only truncate at certain number of modes. So that way, the reduced order model is cheaper, and we can use it to approximate the full order solution. And the thing I want to discuss today is, okay, after we get this reduced order modeling solution, and we use it to approximate the full order solution, and we can predict the solution at an arbitrary time t prime here, And this T prime, in the previous research, usually people predict this given time within the data range. The T prime can be just within the data range that I collect data. I want to do the prediction beyond the data set. That means this T prime is larger than the latest time instance I collected snapshot data. Okay, and of course, when we do approximation, we do introduce error. So here is the way that how you can estimate the error that you introduce by using reduced order model to replace or approximate the full order solution. Okay, so in reduced order modeling, after we do POD, the next task we need to take care is how we want to predict this temporal modes, AKT. Traditionally, people are using Galerkin projection. So Galerkin projection, based on our knowledge of the governing equation, because we definitely need to know about the operator. So what is the operator that actually governing this full order solution? We have to know this before we apply Galerkin projection. And this operator can be spatial differential operator. For example, in the partial differential equation. Once we know this operator, then we can frame or formulate the differential equation to solve for AKT. And then if we know the solution for AKT, then for any given time, then I can simply calculate this AKT and then send it back to the POD decomposition and then predict the solution. However, you have seen that this approach, traditional approach, requires to know about this operator. That means I need to know the governing equation. But for example, for experimentalists, they don't want to touch the governing equation or PDE. So that means this approach is too intrusive and is not really good for black box problems for experimental data. And also, if we are dealing with more complicated problem, for example, with unsteady moving boundaries, and this basically to evaluate this term, we need to introduce extra terms associated with this moving boundaries. And usually those terms are nonlinear. It's very expensive to evaluate. And if the dynamics itself is unsteady, we need to evaluate this term every time. So that make the reduced order modeling itself very expensive and then overshadow the benefit from using reduced order modeling. So the approach that we propose is, let's do something different. Okay, here we use Gaussian process regression enabled non-intrusive approach. And here, basically, all we need is data. Okay, we don't have to know any operator or equation. So given the data, we treat the data as training inputs, and we want to predict on different time instances. And here, okay, the outputs will be my temporal modes, AK, at different times. And all we need to do is we need to find or construct a Gaussian process model. And we use the training data to find the mean function and correlation function, such that we know about this Gaussian process model, and then we can make prediction for the output at any given time. That's the idea. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is this, we can already predict for the temporal mode. For the solution in the domain that we are all set, okay, we are able to predict the solution in the domain, especially if the domain has fixed boundary. However, here we consider there is some moving boundary. The moving boundary itself is also time evolving. So here we need to also predict how those boundary parameters are evolving over time. So here, for example, if we know the parameters that can fully characterize those moving boundaries, let's call them gamma. And we just need to also predict or find a model to represent their time dependence, such that we can use that model to predict at a future time how those parameters are evolving and how the boundary is moving to the new position, and so on. So those parameters, for example, if you are considering a rigid body, those parameters can be just the translational and rotational displacements and velocity of the center of mass. If you are dealing with a deformable boundary, then those parameters can be some principal components that can represent the deformation of the boundary. Again, we use a Gaussian process model to represent this time dependence of those parameters. And we need to use the data to train and construct the model. Okay, so now we want to use the constructed model to predict those parameters at a future time. Okay, so now it seems we're all set because we already construct the reduced order model, and next thing is we just do the prediction. However, in the existing approach, you probably have seen that people do this time extrapolation based on try and error approach. Basically, they are given some data, and then they say, okay, let's construct the reduced order model, and let's make the prediction, make the forecast, and see how much extrapolation we can make. Here, we don't like that try and error approach, so we want to propose some principled approach. So we derive some theoretical criteria, and those criteria can help us to determine as a prior knowledge that given a set of data and how furthest the forecast time can be beyond the data set. And from the way that how we construct the reduced order model, we know that there are three constraints that limit the furthest time that we can extrapolate. So here, the first one is from POD. The other two are from the Gaussian process regression. And in the paper, we explained how we derive those theoretical criteria. But here, basically, in the application that what we can do is, given your desired accuracy or tolerance, you can use this criteria to calculate the furthest forecast time. And then you know that, okay, this reduced order model can allow us to further forecast the future time at a particular time. And that way, okay, you already know, okay, that will be the furthest time I can predict using this reduced order model. You don't have to try and error. Okay, and then based on this, I want to give some example. The first numerical example is Berger's equation. And almost everybody who is doing reduced order modeling is going to use Berger's equation as a validation. So I'm going to do that too. So here I'm using a general Berger's equation. It has advection and also a viscous term. Okay, this Berger's equation has identical solution. So I can use that solution as my snapshot data, which is not required, okay, as long as you have snapshot data. But here, as an example, I just simply use this one, uses analytical solution to generate data. And here I fixed the Reynolds number at 500. And I take only 20 snapshots from the data. So only 20 solutions at different time instances will be my data. And then I construct my reduced order model. So for this case, I return only 4 POD modes and also set a tolerance for the uncertainty level in the Gaussian process regression. And then given those, I construct my reduced order model, and then I want to predict the solution UXT at future times up to p asterisk equals to 0.6. You can see this is not in the data range. Data range only up to 0.5, but I want to predict at a future time. Okay, so here basically shows some results, and here the figure shows how each of the POD mode, the temporal coefficient AK, and in terms of Gaussian process regression and how the extrapolation or prediction is doing. So here, after it's 0.5 is my prediction. And here I'm using this band to represent the uncertainty level. So basically, once the prediction going further in time, we can see the uncertainty level increases. That's why we cannot just doing this prediction for forever. So we cannot just keep doing the prediction for the future time. We definitely is limited by some uncertainty level using Gaussian process regression. And this uncertainty level basically give us the criteria that we can decide for this case, I only can project up to 0.6. And for this mode, you can definitely say the uncertainty level is even higher. Okay, and here we also calculate the error we are making when we use reduced order model to reproduce the full order solution. And again, with the future time that we predict going further and further, then error increases. And then we definitely need to stop at a certain time that say, okay, this is the furthest we can predict using the reduced order model. Okay, after this benchmark Burger's equation, now let's move to some moving boundary problem. So here I want to deal with, again, just a simple problem, but with moving boundary. Here, let's say you have two squares. They are freely moving in a shear flow. And you can say during their movement that this is a pressure field. The pressure field actually changed quite significantly. We want to predict in the future time, okay, what are their positions and what will be the entire pressure field. And those are the things we want to predict for such a problem. Okay, again, in this problem, we use simulation data. So we did numerical simulation. And again, we collect 20 snapshots. And then we construct the reduced order model, again, keep 4 POD modes and set up our tolerance for Gaussian process regression. And then we want to do prediction. We want to predict the solids, free moving solids, their new position at the future time. And at that time, the entire velocity and pressure fields. Okay, so yes, we can do this. And here, when we check the result, now we do the prediction at a future time t equals to 3.0. This is definitely beyond the data set range. And one thing we realized, if we zoom in and look at the prediction, for example, this is the pressure field prediction. We cut a line and look at how the pressure is distributed along that line. And this is a different line, okay? And then we plot our prediction and the data from numerical simulation. So we see those big arrow places, okay? There are 2 places along each line. There definitely show larger arrows. So here we analyze the reason for those arrows are those regions were actually part of those moving body, but not in the fluid domain at all. In other words, in the snapshot data that we collected, those regions are not in the same domain as when we do the prediction for the future time. So that caused problem because in this fluid-solid interactions, the gradient of solution is discontinuous across the boundary. Okay, then we need to do a correction step because we want higher order accuracy. We want those arrows to be fixed. And then the idea here is we can do a high order interpolation. We know the other places that the accuracy is good. So we do a higher order interpolation from the neighbor region, and then we can fix the arrow here in those local region. And here we use a high order least square optimization for the interpolation that we can do this correction step. And you can compare with correction, and then basically the reduced order model prediction is overlapping with the data very well. Okay, and then we solved all the issues in this reduced order modeling. And the next thing I want to think of how to use this reduced order modeling is we already discussed, okay, the furthest forecast time can be limited by how we construct the reduced order modeling. But how can we fully use this construct the reduced order modeling in a real application? For example, this is one result showing for the same simulation that you just saw in the animation. So if I want to know the trajectory of one solid body, okay, and I want to know it for a long time, and I can adaptively integrate the reduced order modeling with numerical simulations. So what does it mean? It means, for example, in this plot, we show that in the beginning, okay, we definitely need data. Okay, so we run this numerical simulation to get snapshot data. And then we construct reduced order model from those data. And we already know, okay, the furthest forecast time for this reduced order model. And then I know, okay, for this part, I can just use reduced order model to do the prediction. And then I use the full order solution reproduced by the reduced order model to restart the numerical simulation, because I know the reduced order modeling will fail for further prediction. And then I can restart the numerical simulation to continue collecting the high fidelity data, and then again stopped, and then revisit to reconstruct the reduced order model and then make the prediction. So by this adaptive integration of the two things, reduced order modeling and high fidelity simulation, we are able to run a long simulation with reduced cost compared to purely using numerical simulation. And here I want to make a comparison for the computer time. Okay, so in this particular case, the reduced order modeling prediction replaced 1/3 of the simulation. So basically the red parts is 1/3 of the entire trajectory. And here we just use a desktop. It's a very common desktop. And then for this high fidelity simulation, it takes about 21 seconds to run from t equals to 2.0 to t equal to 3.0. And this is already parallel scalable implementation. However, using reduced order model, including construction, and also employing for prediction, the total time is less than 5 seconds. Okay, here we only use a serial MATLAB code. So this part is not, the implementation is not optimized yet. So it is possible to further speed up this reduced order modeling part. And also, if we are not looking at such a simple example, but looking at a more complicated simulation, more expensive simulation, then this can be much more longer than the time we show here. So that means there is a hope that for a real world problem, this kind of adaptive integration of reduced order modeling with high fidelity simulation can save a lot of computational cost. And here I also want to mention that, so numerical simulations is one way to use reduced order modeling. In this case, actually those data part, the blue part, can be replaced by experimental measurements. So that means we collect data from experiment, then use reduced order model to do prediction, and then collect experimental data. So currently we're working with one colleague at UW-Madison to integrate their experimental measurement with the reduced order modeling. Okay, so here's some discussion on this topic. So when we do this reduced order modeling, and basically everything is data driven. We didn't assume any equation, and it's non-intrusive compared to Galerkin projection, and it's applicable to experimental data. And we predict the full order solution, for example, the entire flow field, velocity and pressure at the desired time inside or outside the data range. So here we focus on outside because inside people have done a lot for the inside prediction. And to avoid the trial and error, we provide the theoretical criteria such that we can have a priori determination of the furthest forecast time permitted by the reduced order model. And of course, it's not perfect. The work is not perfect yet. So we noticed that one major factor limiting the furthest forecast time for this reduced order model is actually from POD. So recall, POD restricts the state variable to evolve in the linear subspace. So the reduced spaces we can find from POD is linear. That make some of the prediction can be very limited by basically reduced order modeling can only represent in the linear subspace. So alternative approach will be replacing the linear space basis by nonlinear manifolds. And we are working on this and have seen some progress and benefit from using nonlinear manifolds to replace PLD. Okay, this is basically the first topic. To make myself.
So we have a couple of more minutes if you want to wrap it up.
Okay, sure. So in second case, if we are not dealing with a dynamic system with moving boundary, and instead we are dealing with a high-dimensional discrete system, and has many DOFs and is governed by a high-dimensional ODEs, and how we do reduced order modeling. So here, since I don't have much time, I just give you a very briefly the idea. For example, if we are looking at some molecular dynamics, and we are looking at some atomistic description of a system, for example, some polymers or some materials and so on, and the system is governed by the Hamiltonian. So the idea here is to establish a reduced order model, we need to first select some relevant observables. Okay, you are only interested in a small set of such observables, but not others. You can just eliminate other degrees of freedoms. And of course, if we do so, then we'll get reduced dimension representation, and the equation will be easy to solve and more efficient to solve. And but we need to establish such an equation. But the difficulty things are the unresolved the degrees of freedoms can have effect on the result variables. And the most worst situation is those result variables and unresolved degrees of freedoms, they have very similar time scales. You cannot easily separate them by just doing average or integration. Usually those are the two challenges. So the idea here is even though we are doing reduced order modeling, we still want to reproduce the main features of the system. So here, let's see, as an example, we choose this kind of reduced representation, what we call CG coordinate. And here we can use generalized Langevin equation as the framework to establish such a reduced dimension equation. And we can use data-driven approach to determine or specify some of the terms in this equation, because the equation only gives you a general formulation. For a particular case, you don't really know the specific form for certain terms. And we want to use data-driven approach given the data and how we can construct those terms for a particular system. That's the idea. And here, briefly speaking, so for the first term, when we construct this term, we use a deep neural network. The reason is we know that this function is nonlinear and it's a function of multiple variables. However, we don't really know anything beyond this. Previous approach, they usually assume some ad hoc function for this U of R, and then try to calibrate the parameters for this function. So here we say, okay, without knowing anything, then we can use deep neural network to learn this nonlinear function and the function of multiple variable. However, simply doing this won't work. The reason is we cannot guarantee that this deep neural network model will give you a physical representation of the function. One thing, for example, we know that this function has to satisfy certain symmetries. But if you just simply do unsupervised learning, then you cannot guarantee the model will satisfy those symmetries. So we have to take care of those by making the input satisfy those symmetries first, and then use this input to train the model such that output automatically will satisfy those symmetries. And for the memory kernel, the way that we use to infer this memory kernel is we use the optimization approach. And here I skip those details. And since this optimization problem is challenging, that we don't really know the closed form for the objective function, and it's expensive to evaluate and it's noisy, then we choose a Bayesian optimization for doing this optimization problem to determine the memory kernel. Okay, and then so that I can skip this. So basically, eventually, we after we construct this reduced order model, and then we can check if it definitely captured the main features, even though it's much cheaper to solve. So here, basically, some parameters that can show the static feature of this reduced order model. And we did two kinds of reduced order model. And this one using deep learning and deep neural network, from the result, you can tell it outperforms the traditional way. And we can also look at dynamic features, for example, velocity autocorrelation function or some diffusion coefficient. We can also see basically the reduced order model captures the mean features. And the tail, the long tail, has some discrepancy because it's already too small compared to the interesting value. So basically here, I want to convince you that for this kind of system, we can also do reduced order modeling, and the reduced order modeling can save the computational cost. So here is a speed up factor estimation for 3 different kinds of systems. And for using the deep learning, it's slower because I can explain later why it's slower. But basically, we expect 1 to 2 orders speed up using the reduced order model. So here, some discussion about this is the cost of learning and calling the deep neural network model. It is a little bit significant. The reason is, remember I mentioned there is a descriptor matrix we have to assemble when we train the model and also employ the model to make the prediction. So that part actually dominates the cost. So we definitely need to do further research to try to reduce this cost. And also the Bayesian optimization, as most optimization, it can be more expensive when we increase the dimension of parameters. So one way to resolve this issue is we can use feature space-based Bayesian optimization. It will allow us to reduce the high-dimensional parameter space to a low-dimensional feature space. And then the optimization can be done in the low-dimensional space. That will be very significant for working on optimization problem. And lastly, we are recently start working on non-equilibrium dynamics and process. The numerical example showed they are, although they are dynamic, they are basically in a equilibrium state in statistics. But the more challenging things will be how about non-equilibrium process in dynamics. So we are working on this currently. With that, I will stop here. Basically, I discussed 2 topics, and here are the 2 papers about the details. And this is our group website. And you are welcome to visit and talk with us about any collaboration, or if you are interested in using our code for doing your reduced order modeling. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Wenxiao.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have a few questions in the chat. Maybe Pramod, you can take.
Sure. Yeah. The first question is for Professor Hatzell. So the question is from Partha. He's asking, for photocatalytic nitrogen fixation, could you elucidate a bit on the promise of non-catalytic routes? I think Professor Hatzell has answered this question on the chat, but perhaps for the benefit of everyone, you can elaborate.
Yeah, so it would be non-catalytic, and by that I mean that the nitrogen activation process wouldn't occur in the interface, and perhaps would occur in the bulk or in a liquid phase. And so that could occur with photocatalysts because you have both reactive holes and electrons which can interact with species. And so what we're looking at is co-feeding in a carbon source, perhaps even carbon dioxide, but maybe other sources like methanol and things like that. And then you can easily oxidize with carbon sources, generating some sort of radical, which maybe, depending on the stability of the radical, could migrate into the bulk to activate the nitrogen. And that's really what we're trying to probe with our EPR spectroscopy at Argonne National Lab. Are there interactions between these radicals and nitrogen? And we'll see in the future.
So there is a
Thank you.
question for Professor Pan.
Mm-hmm.
So, how is a kernel function chosen for the Gaussian process regression? Is the standard radial basis function used?
Yes, that's the standard radial basis function used. And the detail is in this paper, the first paper. We didn't try all different kind of kernel functions. I think the basic one works well.
Okay. So there is a second question here. Thank you for your nice talk, Dr. Pan. Have you tried different GPR kernels to check the sensitivity? Assuming that in ROM, the reduced order models, the different mode, shape parameters and moving boundaries are assumed to be independent in GPRs. What if the dependency between the parameters is considered with multiple input, multiple output GPR?
Yeah, that's a good question. Since here we only consider the GPR for constructing the model for one variable, which is the time, and we didn't do multiple variable GP model yet. And here we actually didn't play with any parameters. And yes, I agree we need to learn about the sensitivity. We haven't done that yet. But I think in one variable GP model and using the standard kernel, and we solve the maximum likelihood function, and that seems robust for the examples we looked. But I'm not sure for other examples. Yeah, that I believe there's something that we need to further investigate for more complicated examples.
So I have a quick question for Professor Hatzell. So you mentioned that there are these activation sites on titanium dioxide, which help in the catalysis. I also see a lot of papers on hot electron generation in photocatalysis. Are these two related in any way, or so? For example, if you mentioned if you use a sufficiently low band gap, then you would absorb across the solar spectrum. And would you then generate hot electrons, and would they be sufficient to do the catalysis, or do you need the surface?
So I think I didn't catch the last few words. What was the last few words that you said?
Yeah, so my question was about like whether hot electrons generated in nanoparticles, for example, can catalyze these kinds of reactions, or do you need the surface states or surface vacancies?
I think we're seeing a lot of. I'm seeing a lot of from my own work. I don't know, but I am seeing a lot of work which is indicating either some sort of some of the plasmonic effects are possible, and some of the hot electrons as well. I'd say that I would say that the number of papers in these work are so low. I think we got to see if it's consistent or not. But there's even some, I think it's possible. I would like to see more on it. I think there's only a handful of papers at this point. But it's not, the surface sites that we're referring to are more so like oxygen vacancies with interstitials. And there's been a lot of theory which indicate that the nitrogen orientation at those sites significantly weakens it. But it depends on which theorist you talk to, whether it does actually weaken the nitrogen triple bond or not. And so that's what I was referring to in terms of the active site. Yeah.
Thank you. So there is a question for Dr. Pan from Mr. Anirban Chandra. So can time-dependent boundary conditions be incorporated into the reduced order model method? The second question is, are conservation laws being satisfied?
That's a good question. So yeah, for the first question, yes. Actually, the one we deal with is a time-dependent boundary. I guess what he or she means is probably deformable boundary. In addition to moving, it also deforms with time. Yes, it's definitely applicable. The one thing that we need to do is to figure out the parameters that can fully characterize the deformation. So in literature, people has done in structure mechanics that how they extract the dominant principal components to represent a deformable boundary. And then if we have that set of parameters, and then we have the data for how they depend on different time instances, and then we can use the same methodology to construct reduced order modeling. So what is the second question again? I forgot.
Or conservation loss are there?
I think that's a very good question. So in my case, since the problem has the advection term is not highly dominant, I believe if we consider really high Reynolds number flow, the conservation will be important. So currently, the reduced order modeling does not constrain conservation. And I believe some conservation constrained machine learning approach should be used when we train the reduced order model. And in my case, I didn't consider those conservation constraint yet.
There is a new question, again for Dr. Pan, I think. Is it possible to predict future state of flow from snapshot-based ROM for multi-phase flow with phase change? Okay,
yeah, that's a good question. Again, we need to, in the case I predict the entire flow field, velocity field, and pressure field. In multi-phase flow, basically, I think everything is the same unless the moving boundary is different from solid boundary. So the moving boundary depends on the phase, how the phase is changing. The moving boundary, again, we need to find some dominant components to represent how the moving boundary can be characterized by a finite set of parameters. And I believe another challenge in doing multi-phase flow with very significant phase transition is the reduced basis that we find from POD, because that reduced basis is in the linear space. So I believe that actually can be the dominant limiting factor for doing highly transitional multi-phase flow, because the reduced basis we found from data probably cannot be representative for some different flow in the future time that phase transition is significantly different. If that's the case, and then as I said, probably we need to find another way to find the reduced basis, for example, using nonlinear manifolds instead of POD.
Okay, I do not see any further questions in the chat. Perhaps if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Marta? Hey, Marta, this is Andre. A quick question to you. I was trying to, because I'm not familiar with the field of nitrogen cycle. Are those reactions gas phase or liquid phase?
They're primarily gas phase because nitrogen is the nitrogen fixation is gas phase. Yeah, but the nitrate is aqueous phase.
Okay, so then maybe I have a couple of questions for gas phase. For the gas phase, if you consider photocatalytic route, even though semiconductor behavior is pretty well understood both in the bulk and interfaces, as soon as you incorporate carbon, and that seems like you have a significant improvement in performance when you have carbon in the system. They serve as essentially serve as a source of, first of all, big scavengers of electrons and holes. So it prevents, you cannot produce essentially p-n junction at the interface to be able to separate and have sufficient lifetime for those carriers. So this is first question as far as how feasible it is. So as soon as you introduce essentially carbon in the surface, it's kind of a cure for photocatalysis. So how do you balance this effect? So it helps surface chemistry, but at the same time kills photocatalysis part. And if you want to have photocatalysis, you want to work with a pristine semiconductor of appropriate band gap, but then your surface chemistry, you essentially, even though thermodynamically it's possible, but kinetically you could not run the reaction. How do you balance those two constraints? Do you have thoughts, ideas, or maybe hypotheses?
Yeah, no, great question. So actually, the carbon is not on the surface. So we have two hypotheses. One is that it's a carbon titanium bond, and so that's not a carbon. That's not a surface species. That would be a bound species. And so the question is that carbon titanium bond active? Okay, so active site. And then the second part is that, yes, you're exactly right. You made a good point in that the carbon is oxidized by the photogenerated holes. So the carbon doesn't stay on the surface because it's going to be oxidized and removed through the oxidation process. So therefore, the oxidation process kind of makes sure that the surface is clean. And then the carbon is transformed into a carbon radical, which can migrate into the solution phase away from the catalyst site. So in neither case are we putting necessarily carbon on the catalyst, but having a carbon on the catalyst was the experiment that enabled us to observe that behavior.
Okay, cool. All right. So the second question for the liquid phase for the catalyst, and I apologize if someone wants to ask a question, I'll shut up. But I'm really curious about in the presence of hydroxyl it's aqueous solution, right? So the hydroxyl usually in the edge of the electronic band or the electronic energy level. So as a result, if you look at the band structure for the catalyst, the bulk, let's say for titanium dioxide, and the surface are substantially different. So as a result, essentially what it does, it shifts your redox potential, reduction oxidation potential, and slows down the kinetics. So you kind of look at the reduction potential and oxidation potential of the bulk, and then you design your process to be able to work with this potential. But then if you expose to aqueous solution, hydroxyl in the the presence in dissociate in the water, it's very strongly absorbed to the surface, and it bends essentially electronic levels. It was a huge problem, even for photocatalytic electrolysis. So people could not go around this. It's a nightmare. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's why we're using titania as a model catalyst, but honestly, half of our experiments are gas phase and half are liquid. In the liquid phase, though, you're right. These materials don't even make hydrogen, and so that was why initially we didn't believe that it was a reduction-based process because it couldn't be, and that's why we were actually thinking about this as a hole-driven process. But I would say, like, sustaining this long term, we would never want to do this in an aqueous phase. We're seeing the same parallel question being asked in the electrochemical world. It's not actually even the hydroxyl issue, but more so the proton, like just in general protons and competing for hydrogen evolution, even though with the titania, we don't have to worry about hydrogen evolution. But yeah, anytime you have a competing reactant, you're going to decrease your energy efficiency, you're going to decrease your yield. And so you want to design the system so you don't have a competing reactant. And so ideally, you would want to do this in the gas phase long term.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. So I don't see more questions, already 4:56. So I'll go ahead and first thank both Marta and Wenxiao. It was a very exciting talk. I know time was short, but I think this is great. If you want, you can send your slide deck to Ben, and we can link it to your profile on the Frontiers website we have. These talks will be online, and you guys can forward it to your students and others who are interested. With that, I'll just close it out with next week. As Pramod said, we have thermal system. We have 2 speakers from Texas A&M and University of Minnesota. So hopefully you all can join in again. Once again, thank you, everyone. And if you want to stay on, you can stay. I'll just stop the recording.
All right, let's thank both the speakers.